Good morning, everyone. Can you signal your ability to hear me by raising your hand? Just one person. We've been having some audio challenges this morning as we were getting set up. Okay, I see Robert did. Great, thank you. So it looks like you guys you'll be able to hear me and the instructor, but for some reason he and I are having trouble hearing each other. So welcome and good morning. I recognize some names, some past attendees, and you are used to seeing Karen here, and Karen retired just a week or so ago, so I'm filling in today. My name is Kathy Martin. I'm the communications manager with SCV Water. So I'm going to go through just a couple of intro slides and then we'll get started. So welcome to our virtual gardening class on a very real problem of controlling weeds, pests, and diseases. Let's see. Okay, so our meeting format is going to go about an hour. There'll be plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. And on your little control panel, which I've highlighted in red, you'll see a box for questions. So you're welcome to put your questions in there, and we will save those and answer them all at the end. If you're joining us for the first time and aren't familiar with our agency, SCV Water is a full-service agency. We serve the entire Santa Clarita Valley, about 74,000 retail customers, which I'm assuming most of you are one of those. We have just launched our Drought Ready program. You've probably seen the announcements from the governor, pretty severe drought that's hitting California. So we've launched the webpage droughtreadyscv.com. We invite you to visit there to see all the ways that we have for making it easy for you to save water. Just yesterday, he updated with a request for us to voluntarily save 15%. It comes out to about 30 gallons a day for an average household. And we've got lots of tips on there on how you can do that. We can work together and make this work. You can find us on the website in a number of ways. All of our social media accounts, plus yourscvwater.com is your home base for all things water in the Santa Clarita Valley. We've got a lot of great rebate programs. So, as you're looking for ways to save 15%, it could be as simple as just getting a rebate for a smart water controller. So check out our conserve.yourscvwater.com for lots of programs we offer for money back rebates on some water saving resources. Speaking of, so smart irrigation controller is one, $150, and you can control it from your phone, makes it super simple. And then we also have a lot of landscape resources. Of course, John Windsor, our instructor, is one of our best ones. We've got some stuff online for landscape inspiration, troubleshooting your irrigation, how much you should water, all of that information is available on our website. So that ends my section. I am very pleased to introduce our instructor today, John Windsor. Let me switch what we're sharing here. All right. Okay, John, take it away.
Okay. I guess this is my cue to start. So hopefully you can all hear me out there. We have had some audio problems. But anyway, we'll just get to it. There's 3 parts to this presentation, and they are the 3 parts of gardening that we would really rather avoid. Weeds, pests, and diseases. But in this presentation, we'll at least give you some tips on how to control these 3 problems. Next. There we go. Okay, so the definition of a weed can be any plant that's growing out of place or a plant that is more detrimental than beneficial. And a desirable plant to one person can be a weed to another. Now, typically, weeds produce an abundance of seeds, and that's why there's so many of them, and they come up everywhere because the wind can blow them. Uh, we oftentimes blame our gardeners for bringing weeds into our yards, but I'm not really sure that's accurate. Uh, the wind blows the seeds of weeds and blows them everywhere. I've seen weeds come up 100 miles from the nearest gardener. So it's these seeds that can be blown, and weeds typically produce an abundance of seeds. If we get rid of the plants when they're still young, then perhaps we can eliminate a lot of the seeds. And many plants have different ways of dispersing the seeds. The tumbleweed is called a tumbleweed because it rolls around and round and round. But that's part of it dispersing its seeds. Every time it rolls like that, a little piece of the plant breaks off and sticks into the ground, and more tumbleweeds come up. So there's many ways of dispersing seeds. You've probably seen dandelions with their puffy little seed head floating off. And many seeds can remain dormant for long periods of time, simply waiting for the right conditions. Uh, rain being, or moisture of some sort being the best condition for them. Many seeds will wait until the weather is right, until it's warm enough for it. And they have the ability to survive adverse conditions. They can lay underneath snow until the snow melts and up they sprout. Next. So, how do weeds affect us? Well, they affect the plants by competing for the water, the light, and the nutrients. They reduce the quality and appearance of the landscape. They increase maintenance costs, labor, and they serve as an alternative host for pests and diseases. And that last one is pretty important because pests sometimes go to a particular plant and don't kill it. They won't kill a particular plant, but they can reproduce on it and they can live for long periods of time on it until they're ready to go to another plant, a host plant that they can, in fact, eat or uh, in some way uh, suck the juices from the plant or live off of a plant, typically a plant that we like. Next. So there's, here in Southern California, we have weeds that can sprout, it seems like, all the time. We get weeds coming up all the time. But there's two real seasons for weeds. There's the common winter weeds that will germinate in the fall, and then there's the spring weeds. And here's a couple of the more common ones, the lamb's quarter and the chickweed. The chickweed you'll see a lot in the winter, cool areas. It doesn't need full sun, but it will grow in partial sun. Uh, and it just comes up everywhere. And if you look on both these, you'll see that they've already flowered. The flower becomes the seed heads. And you see the little white flowers on the chickweed. Those are the seed heads. They're ready to disperse and blow away in the wind and come up somewhere else. Next. Now, the summer weeds, I really think are the worst. Uh, we get spurge, the one on the left side of your screen there, and that is a dickens to eliminate. The plant itself, you can dig it out fairly easily, but by the time it's as big as that picture and you pull it out, it's probably going to drop 1,000 seeds. Now the purslane in the next slide there, you can see its yellow flowers. It's very difficult to see the flowers on the spurge, but they're there and they're producing seeds. So spraying for these weeds will kill them, but it's the seeds that have already fallen that prove to be the real troublesome thing. Next, here's a couple of weeds that actually take 2 years to produce. The first year, quite often, is underground root production and then a little bit of growth above ground. By the second year, it reproduces. In other words, that's when the flower comes, seeds come, and it can be quite the nuisance. If eliminated in the first year, you're fine. You're wonderful because it hasn't produced a flower by then. But those thistles, the pokey little guys, I wouldn't suggest pulling them, I'd suggest digging them out. Next. And then there are perennial weeds. And these are weeds that not only produce seeds, but they have some form of vegetative parts that allow them to reproduce. So in other words, pulling them or digging them, if you leave one little piece in the ground, it's coming back. And quite often, these weeds have a very deep root. So pulling is not effective at all with perennial weeds. These weeds really need to be sprayed, and in some instances, sprayed with very selective herbicides. Herbicides that will just control the weed and not the surrounding lawn or plants. Those are, in fact, called selective herbicides. Next. So, stop them before they start. Don't bring home weeds. If you see weeds in the containers, uh, pull them out before you get them home. Uh, if you're planting grass seed, use high quality grass seed that says little or no crop or weed seed. The real problem is topsoil. That's the real problem. Not bagged topsoils, but bulk topsoils. Because bulk topsoils are not inspected or cleaned or in any way prevented from having weed seeds and vegetative parts in it. So bringing in bulk topsoil into your yards or into your garden can be a real problem. So always use soil amendments that are free of weeds, and those would be bagged amendments generally. Or if you're going to be buying in bulk, make sure it's a single product. Maybe redwood shavings, maybe fir bark or something. But anything that you buy in bulk, this is topsoil or 50-50 mix, well, that means it's a combination of topsoil and amendments. Okay, so keep, even outside of your vegetable garden or flower gardens, keep the weeds out because their seeds will blow and they can go anywhere they want. Keep your equipment clean. And now, once again, I know I've already told you that we probably blame the gardeners and their mowers for a lot more than they're actually responsible for doing. Next. So, mechanical control. So hand removal is okay if you're pulling the weed, okay? And if you're doing it yourself, if you hire somebody to hand pull, of course, that's very labor intensive and can be quite expensive. Now, cultivation, while it might make the soil look nice and aerate it, if you're using a pre-emergent herbicide, it actually destroys the effectiveness of it. So if you're going to be cultivating, or if your gardener's going to be turning up your soil constantly, pre-emergence may not be the way to go. But if you're going to have areas where you're not going to be turning it over and raking, then pre-emergence would be a great idea, and they can last for an entire season. Next. Now, rototilling is fine when you're putting in a garden or a lawn or a flower bed. But if you had perennial weeds in that area, the rototiller is just going to chop them up and disperse them. Now, annual weeds, weeds that come up at one season and die, rototilling will kill them. So it's typically recommended weed first, then go in and rototill. Okay? Now, mowing will actually help to prevent weeds from getting into your lawn. Keep your mower as high as possible. Set your mower up high so that your lawn is high. In the winter, some people like to do one short mowing and remove their clippings, etc., and perhaps cut some weeds at that time. But low mowing will weaken the turf, so we probably don't recommend that. And just regular mowing of your lawn will eliminate tall growing weeds, perhaps getting some of them before the weeds can set seeds. Next. Biological control. You've maybe seen goats and sheep rented out to clear hillsides, to remove weeds, to prevent brush from building up, to prevent fires, etc. And that's great on hillsides and open spaces. But the difficulty is in getting the goats and the sheep to only eat the weeds that we want them to eat. So for most of us, the biological control is probably not going to work. Next. So the chemical controls would be, as I mentioned, pre-emergence. These are chemicals that inhibit seed germination. They prevent the seeds from germinating, so they stop the weed before it comes. And you'll apply it to the soil after you've weeded and water it in, okay? Very important there, don't disturb the surface after you've used your pre-emergence. So cultivating or digging in the area reduces the effectiveness. So do your weeding, do your planting, whatever you want to do, then apply the pre-emergent, water it in, and you're good to go. Next. So here's some other methods. Applying 2 to 4 inches of mulch after the pre-emergent application helps to hold the pre-emergent in, prevents sunlight from getting into the soil, and is very helpful in preventing weeds. And most of the pre-emergents do have to be watered in, and it's relatively inexpensive. It covers a large amount of area and is very easy to use. Now, corn gluten is an organic, so for folks that are gardening 100% organically, corn gluten has been shown to stop a few weeds, not all, but a few weeds. A product called Amaze, which is a chemical preventer, is very effective and prevents hundreds of weeds from germinating. Next. So we just talked about pre-emergence. Now we're going to talk about post-emergence. These are the chemicals that kill the weeds after they sprout. And there's different ones, and they work using different modes of action. A contact spray, that just kills the parts that are sprayed. Vinegar would be a contact spray. Then there are weed killers that are translocated, which means they move through the vascular system of the plant and they go down and they destroy the roots. So once again, you spray them on top of the weed on the green foliage and they move through the plant down to the root. This is probably the most effective way of controlling weeds. Next. Now, I mentioned previously selective herbicides, and these are wonderful. If you know your weed, it's very helpful to use selective herbicides because they will only kill specific plants without killing desirable plants. And there's two broad categories here, as there are two broad categories of plants. One is grasses and the other is broadleaf weeds. So there are grass killers that will only kill grasses and not broadleaf plants. For instance, if you get grasses growing up near your roses, you can spray a grass killer that will kill the grassy weeds, but not harm the roses. Then on the other end of the spectrum, there are herbicides that can kill broadleaf plants without killing grasses. So these are the types of weed killers we would use in our lawns. For instance, Weed Be Gone is a very common herbicide that will kill weeds in your lawn but won't harm your lawn. Then there are specialty chemicals, and these target a specific plant. For instance, nutgrass. It's an insidious weed, and it requires a very special chemical to kill it. And it is designed specifically to kill that weed and typically doesn't harm other types of plants. Next. So then there's a whole bunch of these non-selective herbicides. They'll kill whatever you spray them on indiscriminately. I think most people have probably heard of Roundup. That would be non-selective. Roundup would kill both grasses and broadleaf weeds. And once again, there's two types. There's the contacts that spray. You spray on weeds, be they grasses or broadleaves, and they will kill them on contact. And then there's the translocated ones, which they work best when the plant is in the actively growing state. So if you really want to kill weeds, treat them nicely, water them, fertilize them, then spray them. Because when the plant is actively growing, that's when it can take in herbicides much better. And don't be in a hurry to see the weeds die. Several weed killers take a week, 10 days, 2 weeks to kill the weed. But that's okay because that means that the material is translocating down through the leaves, through the stems, and down to the roots. Some of the contact killers, like I mentioned, vinegar, and there's also citric acid and clove oil. they burn the plant immediately. So on those, you may see results in a day or two. Next. So quite often, you can mix the pre-emergent and the post-emergent together at the same time. And then you are killing the weed and preventing its weeds from germinate. Okay. Now, this is pretty common for professional applicators, and they'll often add a small amount of a sticker, maybe a little bit of dishwashing soap, and perhaps even a little bit of fertilizer to the mix, because remember, we want the weed to be actively growing. So sometimes a little bit of fertilizer added to the herbicide helps. And then wait at least 24 hours before you begin your regular watering cycle. Uh, the idea is we want to keep the weed actively growing, which make the herbicide more effective, but we don't want to wash the herbicide off. So after you spray your weeds with weed killers, don't water for 24 hours. Next. You have to read the pesticide label, but it'll scare you to death. It will. I've seen folks that have read the labels and said, nope, that's not for me. But the label does have very important information, particularly if it's a concentrate, how much to mix, when to use it. There may be some heat requirements. In other words, some herbicides maybe won't work if it's below 50 degrees. Some may say don't use them if it's over 85 degrees. So all that information will be found on the label. Next. Okay. So if you had any question as to whether a particular herbicide was going to work for a particular weed or whether it could be used around a particular plant, that information will be available. Next. Okay, so that was the end of the weed part of the presentation. Remember, if you have any questions at any point, you can type them into the chat box and I will answer the questions after the presentation. Okay, so now we're going to talk about insects. And it's good to know what insect you have on the plants and whether or not it is a problem. Most are not, believe it or not. So under the insect categories, we have regular insects, bugs, we have spiders, and mites. And these all fall under the arthropod family. And this is what I want you to read right here. Out of over 3 million kinds of insects, only 3% are considered economically important pests. But this small percentage causes a loss of approximately $4 billion in crops in the United States. So know what the bug is. Maybe you have to control them, maybe you don't. Okay. So insects, they can build a resistance to pesticide. So one thing that we would recommend to you is alternating different modes of elimination of the insects. Maybe one week all you do is go out there and spray them off with a hose. Maybe 1 week you use insecticidal soap, maybe 1 week you use neem oil, but always alternate. Next. So it's important to identify the insect that you're thinking about eliminating. So aphids, everybody should know them, but what you maybe don't know is they come in all different colors. They can be green, red, black, orange, and yellow. But they all do the same thing. They suck the juices from the plant and they leave a sticky secretion behind. And the females, once they've mated once in their life, they can continue to reproduce. And then the youngsters can reach adulthood in anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks. So they prefer the warm weathers. You don't see these too much in the winter, but you'll see them. You'll find them on many different plants, certainly roses and hibiscus. Next. So it says here they seldom kill a plant. I don't think they ever do. They will stunt the growth and curl the leaves, etc. But if an insect was to kill the host plant, the insect would die out. So they have evolved to suck the sap from a healthy plant and be able to live with the plant. So they may cause some troubles, but seldom will they kill it. Okay? Now they do produce honeydew. That's the sticky stuff that you'll find on the foliage and maybe underneath it. And then the ants are attracted to that. So the ants will eat the honeydew and they'll also transport or move the aphids around to other parts of the plant and actually protect the plant from parasitic insects, from ladybugs, and from birds. And then quite often you get a black sooty mold that grows on that honeydew. So there's many different types of controls for aphids. You can get foliar sprays. There's many natural organic foliar sprays. For long-term effect, there are systemic granules that you can put in the ground around the plants, and it keeps the insects off for a full year. And then the biological controls, I think we all know about ladybugs, but there's others. There's parasitic wasps and lacewings that will eat the aphids and many other different types of damaging insects. So the biological controls, that's a really good way to go. Next. So here's an insect that you might not ever see, but you can usually find out they're there. Once again, these will be in trees, citrus trees, oranges, lemons, limes. But because of the way they run and hop, you almost never see them. They can run and hide behind a stem or a leaf, and they can cause troubles. Now, the real problem with them is quite often they come from an infected tree, and when they feed on an infected tree, they can bring the fungus or bacteria to another plant by sucking on it. And this, with some plants like the olive trees, the oleanders, and now the liquid ambers, these leafhoppers are spreading a disease that is, in fact, incurable. So if we can control the leafhoppers, we can slow down the rate of death of many of these trees. Next. Then there's mites, which are actually a spider. So many insecticides won't kill mites. You actually have to use a miticide. You may find these occasionally on your tomato plants if the tomato plants are not out in the open and in the wind. You will never get spider mites in a windy, open area, but up against a wall, in a corner, places like that, the spider mites will congregate and multiply like crazy, especially in the heat of summer. Uh, they're real dickens because by the time you see them, they've already heavily infested the plants. There are some biological controls, and there are some sprays that are very specific for spider mites, usually oil type sprays, neem oil, and some other natural biologicals that work pretty well. But it is interesting that you never get a spider mite out in the open because they are so tiny, they can't fly very well, so they require the wind to move them around. The wind will blow and keep moving them until the wind hits a wall or a corner or an area where the wind can simply circle and the insects can fall out of that wind stream and land on your plants. Uh, they're a dickens, but if you get them before they're too bad, you can control them. Next. Okay. Scale is a real common sort of insect. They don't move. Well, or at least you'll never see them move. There is a stage of life when they're called crawlers. Well, they will crawl out to a stem or a leaf and then just sit there. They just stick their tongues into the stem and that's where they'll live. And all the nutrients that are traveling through that stem, they have their tongue in there and they can suck it all up and they can multiply. And once again, the ants will feed on them and also protect them. So keep your eye open for them. Uh, they can be controlled with an oil type spray. Uh, there's many different types of horticultural oils that will actually suffocate them. And then the systemics that you put in the ground will control them and also prevent them for up to a year. Next. Now here's an interesting little guy. Uh, I seldom worry about them. It's a little spittle bug, and he's a tiny little insect uh, that, as he feeds, he produces this froth around him, and this prevents ladybugs and other predatory insects from getting at him. He's underneath there, and he's feeding away, and the insects can't get at him. They like herbaceous plants. You'll find them on lavenders, rosemary, and sages. Those three plants seem to be the best host plants for them. It may look unsightly, and if it becomes bothersome, you can hose the plant off first. By hosing off the plant, you'll remove the froth, and then you could spray if you so desired, or release predatory insects. With the froth gone, the insect is exposed and can be controlled then. Next. Now, caterpillars. Caterpillars are voracious eaters, and they can chew a plant, they can eat the leaves off a plant in no time at all. Uh, there's many varieties. Of course, you're probably familiar with the one that gets on your tomato plants, but the tent caterpillar eats leaves of trees and shrubs and can completely defoliate a plant. Now, there are many sprays that are natural or biological that have a bacteria that will only affect the caterpillars. So you spray this bacteria on the leaves. When the caterpillar consumes the leaf, he consumes the bacteria, which then goes into his stomach and gives him an upset stomach, and then he can't eat. So it's very selective. These bacteria will only affect caterpillars, so they won't affect ladybugs or praying mantids or anything else. Next. Now here's a new, well, there's many varieties of thrips. Some have been around for a very long time, and then there's a brand new one called the chili thrip that is attacking the roses in Southern California. And once again, thrips are very tiny. Sometimes you can take a white piece of paper and tap your plant onto the white piece of paper, and you'll see these tiny little white or cream colored insects running off very quickly. These are thrips, and they will, what they call rasp, which is to chew the bottom side of a leaf off, and they can be in very high numbers and cause a tremendous amount of trouble. So now there are specific ones that go after the ficus. As I mentioned, there's specific ones that go after the roses, and there's one called a flower thrip that goes after many different types of flowers. So these are a little more common than you might think, but very hard to see. However, their damage does show up as what appears to be the underside of the leaf chewed, but not the top. Next. And whiteflies. And there are many varieties of whiteflies nowadays. A brand new one that seems to like ficus. So they've called it the ficus whitefly. And whiteflies have always been along, but new varieties come along every once in a while, usually imported. But you'll see these whiteflies on geraniums, fuchsias, lantana, hibiscus. Hibiscus gets a very special one, a very special whitefly called the giant whitefly that produces a long white beard on the plant. Cannas also get the giant whitefly. And yeah, they can be devastating. They can be sprayed with an oil spray, and systemics also work pretty well on the whitefly. Next. And then snails and slugs. I think we're all familiar with them. And yes, they come out at night. The sunlight actually kills them. So many of the snail killers actually will contain iron or some form of metal, some naturally occurring form of metal with a bait. They then eat these baits, and the iron or the whatever form of metal it is slows them down, and the sun will come out and kill them. So in the old days, they used a material called metaldehyde, metal dehyde, and that was the most common snail killer. But in large amounts, that could be problematic for dogs, for instance. They used to make the stuff in big pellets called snail pellets. And if the dog ate that, he was going to take a trip to the vet. So nowadays they've switched over to products like Sluggo and other more natural products that still kill the snails and slugs, but are harmless to the birds and the dogs and the cats. Next. Now, okay, so that finishes off the insect part of the presentation. So if there's anything I didn't talk about regarding insects, once again, type it into the little chat box. Because now we're moving on to diseases. And diseases interfere with normal plant development. Some diseases can be deadly to plants, to trees. Some, like powdery mildew, are easily controlled, but by making the environment less suitable, you probably won't get them. In other words, powdery mildew out in the open, if you have roses and you have a rose out in the open, out in the wind, probably won't ever get powdery mildew. But that same rose planted against a wall or in a corner or in the shade will probably get powdery mildew. So planting the correct plants and putting them in the right area will help to control this. So the casual agent, that would be our, let's say, powdery mildew. The susceptible host would be the rose, and the suitable environment would be shade or lack of wind. So sometimes it's difficult to eliminate because they're often blowing in the wind. Powdery mildew is blowing in the wind 24 hours a day. But when it finds a suitable host and a suitable environment, it will land on the leaf and turn the leaf white. Some diseases are very difficult to control, and maybe the best answer is not to plant them or plant a variety of plant that is resistant to it. For instance, fire blight on evergreen pears. Don't plant evergreen pears. Don't plant them. Don't plant flowering pear trees. They will get this disease. And the disease, I don't know if you ever really get rid of it. You can fight it every single year of your life, but I'm not sure you'll ever eliminate it. Next. Okay, the casual agent is visible. This is what we actually see. So for instance, on the powdery mildew, it's the white material that grows on the top of the leaf. For a disease like rust, it's a orange material that grows on the bottom of the leaves, under the leaves. For instance, on a rose or a snapdragon. Okay? The symptom is what is happening to the plant, and it's not always the same. If you get really bad powdery mildew on a rose or on a crepe myrtle, it'll curl the leaves up and ruin the ends of your plants. But knowing the disease will make it much easier to help to control it, assuming it can be controlled. For instance, bacterias. They typically enter through a wound or use another means like an insect to attack a plant. Those leaf hoppers we saw, they can transmit bacterial diseases. Not cleaning your pruning shears, believe it or not, is a way to spread bacterial diseases because you're opening up a wound. Next. So here's something that you'll see all over the Santa Clarita Valley, fire blight on pear trees. And it's called fire blight because it looks like it was scorched. But it's really a bacterial disease, and I've seen it occasionally on loquat and pyracantha. But evergreen pears, I don't think you can grow them without getting this disease. The bees can spread it when it's when the plant is blooming. Bees, flies, and aphids can spread the disease. Also pruning, if you don't sterilize your pruners in between cuts, you can actually spread it. So when you do, get the fire blight, prune out the diseased wood, and go way below where you see the disease, because the disease has already traveled quite a bit further than where you see. It just hasn't destroyed everything yet. So cut at least 12 inches below the infected area and sterilize your tools after each cut. Very important. Next. Then there are some other things that you can prevent much better than you can control. Leaf spots, bacterial leaf spots. They give you black, red, orange, or yellow spots on your leaves. Typically happens when there's excess moisture and warm conditions. Quite often, simply backing off on the watering, cutting your watering considerably, cutting the frequency, and you can stop this. So we don't typically spray for leaf spots. We simply watch the environmental conditions and change them. Okay. Now galls, these are funny looking things that you may see occasionally on your trees or shrubs, roses, and they're spread once again by a bacteria which needs to be physically brought there. And there's a little insect called a gall wasp. It's microscopic that loves to lay its eggs in little cracks. It inadvertently leaves a little bit of this disease behind, and the tree or the plant forms this bulbous knot over that location, even though the insect is long gone and it can't really do anything about the disease other than to continue to make wood. So quite often when we see these, we cut below there and throw it away because we can't stop it. Next. So fungus, these are microscopic little guys, and many are beneficial. We have to have some in our soils, microscopic beneficial fungus and bacteria are very beneficial, and they help to break down the organic matter. Uh, they prevent certain parasites and bad fungus from attacking good guys. So uh, good fungus, good bacteria, we want to inoculate or put it in the soil when we're planting our plants to prevent infestations from these bad guys. Because fungus can penetrate the outer surface as well as through wounds and openings. And in other words, fungal diseases can get into a plant through many different means. And they produce billions of spores. They're constantly in the wind, as I mentioned. There's powdery mildew blowing in the wind 24 hours a day. Okay. What they need, though, is moisture, humidity, susceptible plant, warm temperatures, and the fungus is quite often spread by the wind, the water, the rain. So, as you can see, pretty hard to hide from them, but it is important to know how to control them when you get them. Next. Anthracnose. Here's a terrible disease that attacks trees, especially the sycamore and the ash and the elm. And once again, this is a fungal disease that blows in the wind. It attacks trees, especially after a winter with lots of rain and moisture. So this year it's not so bad. This year the anthracnose, because we've had such a hot, dry year and not much rain, it's not too bad. But during warm, humid, overcast springs, the disease is rampant, and it can cause significant problems to the trees. And pruning, planting resistant varieties. In other words, there are varieties of sycamore, for instance, uh, like the Columbiana, that are very resistant to anthracnose. whereas the regular sycamore, the native, the Platanus racemosa, terribly susceptible to the anthracnose. Next. Then fungus leaf spots or shot holes. Once again, this is going to be more prevalent in moist areas and more prevalent when we have humid, moist weather, particularly in the spring and early summer. There's really nothing you can do once the plant has it. You can prevent it. There are fungicides, copper and sulfur and other sorts of fungicides that can be sprayed on susceptible plants to prevent them from getting this particular disease. Next. And then rust. This is one you might see. This is one that can get on your roses and snapdragons and other plants, typically on the bottom of the leaves. And it looks just like rust. And quite often you can rub your finger on it and you'll get this orange powder on your finger. And it destroys the leaves that it gets on. Most typically starts near the ground and then it slowly moves up the plant. And once again, if you plant resistant varieties or space your plants out so that there's more air circulation, you can eliminate the possibility of getting rust. However, if your plants are close together, you don't have good wind circulation, if you're watering too frequently or watering at the wrong time of day, better chance that you're going to get the rust. Now, rust can also happen in the fall, just like powdery mildew. Powdery mildew can come back again in the fall when conditions are right, which typically means a little bit cooler and a little bit moister. Next. And there's our powdery mildew, probably the most common of the fungal diseases that we see. And it's very easy to see. The white powder shows up on the tops of the leaves, so you can see them just by looking at them. And they love that warm, humid, overcast weather. Now, we didn't get any June gloom this year. We had hot, dry weather. So the only place you should be getting the powdery mildew would be on plants that are either too shaded or not in full sun or enough wind. Near the coast, of course, it's much worse because they have more overcast days. And the crepe myrtles are notorious for getting it. Of course, the roses. The euonymus is a shrub that, unless you plant that plant in full sun, you can probably get powdery mildew. And the coast live oak and the sycamore, these are big trees. They can get the powdery mildew also. So one thing to do is in the early morning, wash your plants off real good with a blast of hard water. Believe it or not, you can wash the spores off and knock them down to the ground. Okay? Don't prune in the spring, prune in the dead of winter, and watch your fertilization because powdery mildew loves new growth, doesn't attack the older leaves nearly as frequently. Next. So now these are diseases of the roots that will kill seedlings and can actually slowly kill bigger plants, trees. Once again, these problems typically are caused by us. We do it. We do something wrong. We plant the plants too deep. If we plant the plant too deep, the crown or the collar will rot. If we water too frequently, we will get root rots. Once we get a root rot going in the soil, the more we water, the more it spreads, and it can go to nearby plants. And the only real answer for that is to water less frequently. I can't think of a single tree on Earth that needs to be watered more than once a week. And you'd be surprised how long certain shrubs can go in between waterings. It's when we water daily that we run into a lot of these diseases. And these can be prevented. They can be prevented. Plant your plants properly. We want to see the roots at the top of the soil. And don't water daily. Those simple things will help to prevent from getting these terrible diseases that can actually kill your plants. Next. Now, verticillium wilt. This is a bad one, and this can affect small plants, vegetables, all the way to large trees like camphor. Camphor trees are notorious for getting verticillium wilt, and it's always caused 100% of the time by excessive water, watering too frequently. And then it will begin on a root, travel up into the plant, and then that root will bring the disease all the way up to the leaves, and then we will get these black leaves, black branches, black twigs, and the fungus is quite often always there, but it just needs wet, warm conditions before they can attack. And once again, if you know that you have verticillium wilt in your soil, buy resistant plants. So don't plant camphor trees. If you plant camphor trees and you water excessively, you can get these diseases. Next. Now, nematodes. Now, nematodes are microscopic little guys that attack the roots of plants. Shouldn't be a problem for most people. It becomes a problem when we plant the same crops year after year in the same location. So, for instance, if we wanted to grow tomatoes in the spring, we would have to plant them in a different spot the next year, a different spot the next year, a different spot the next year. We would have to rotate them out 4 years if we plant the same things in the same spot. Then not only will there be mineral deficiencies and poor looking plants, but they can then become attacked by these little microscopic worms. Now, there are beneficial nematodes, and the beneficial nematodes are a good way to fight off the bad nematodes. So let's just hope you don't ever get these guys, because once they attack the roots, you don't see them, but the plant above ground does very poorly. Okay, next. Well, then these are some fun things that you'll see. Mistletoe. Of course, mistletoe is a parasite. In other words, it can't grow by itself. It can't produce chlorophyll. So it will attach itself to alders, oaks, and sycamores and put their roots into the plant and then start taking the nutrients from the plant. And the best way to eliminate them is to cut them off below where you see them and just remove them, eliminate them. Now, dodder, this is something we see in Santa Clarita on the wild hillsides, even off the freeways. Once again, it's a parasite. It needs other plants to live on, and it's difficult to control because that seed can live in the soil for years, waiting for moist conditions for a wet winter, and then up it comes and it'll attack another plant. To eliminate it, we quite often have to remove the host plant and use sulfate of ammonia when it starts to come back again, because we never really get rid of it. We just hope that we slow it down. And very interesting, dodder, yellow. You'll see it on the hillsides. Maybe if you go hiking up in the hills, you'll see it attacking some of the native plants. Next. So then we have other things that cause problems to plants that we blame on insects or diseases, but they are not. They are what we call casual agents, like mineral deficiency may cause the plant to do poorly, and we may think that that looks like an insect or disease problem. Pesticides. Sometimes if pesticides are sprayed in the area and the wind blows them onto a surrounding plant, once again, the plant will look terrible and it'll look like a disease has hit it. And then physiological. These problems occur once again with uneven watering, especially, remember, most diseases need heat and moisture. So the heat we can't do anything about, it's hot. What we can do is water less frequently, water deeper, but not as often. If we water constantly, if we water daily, or I've even heard of people watering twice a day, believe it or not, it's true, I've heard this. People watering twice a day, every day. Well, that kind of watering will promote every sort of disease known to mankind, and plants will do very terrible. And something that you hopefully won't see too much in your life is damage caused by air pollution. But you would see this near a freeway, near a roadway, and some plants simply can't abide by that. They just can't live near our roadways or parkways or streets. And quite often the plants just look terrible and never thrive. And of course the answer to that would be not to plant that species in that particular area. Next. Okay, so here's some just basic cultural practices that will help us to perhaps not have as many of these problems, these insects, diseases, and weeds. And one is when you see the problem, just eliminate it. Okay? If it's a susceptible host plant, maybe we don't plant that thing anymore. If the environment isn't right for that plant, don't plant it in that environment. If there's something we can do about the environment, can't really do anything, as I mentioned, about the heat. We could do something about the moisture, though. Okay? So many times, if we can manipulate the environment, maybe get more sunlight in there by pruning something back or watching our watering, we can eliminate some of these. So just going to give you some tips here on watering. Water deeply, but infrequently. The best time to water is between 6 and 8 a.m. The very worst time to water is between 4 p.m. and 4 a.m. Fertilizing, do it moderately. Do it lightly. Don't overdo it. And truthfully, probably best not to even fertilize during the summer. Start with healthy plant material. Start with plants that aren't known for getting insect or disease problems, okay? Disinfect your tools. If you're pruning disease out, if you're pruning diseased parts of a plant, disinfect your tools in between each cut. Dispose of the debris properly. If you're cutting mistletoe off of a tree, throw it in a plastic bag and dispose of it. Okay? Control the weeds. Control the weeds as soon as you see them. Okay? Rotate your crops. I mentioned your nematodes can be prevented by rotating your crops. Don't plant the same thing in the same spot year after year. And if there's a particular plant that you like, that you want to grow, see if there's a resistant variety. If you like roses, but you don't like the powdery mildew, maybe investigate that. Maybe research some varieties of roses that are more resistant to the powdery mildew. Okay. Next. Okay, so once again, we have our chemical controls for these problems. One is preventative. Okay, simply, as I mentioned, some of your leaf spot diseases and some things can be prevented by spraying copper or sulfur prior to the disease coming around. Curative, once the disease is already there. Next. Okay, now I think we're going to do some Q&A. And
Yeah.
once
John, are
again,
you able to
your
hear me?
questions will have been typed and sent to the presenter, and then she will hopefully
Yes.
tell me the questions.
Can you hear
However,
me, John? So let me call you.
we're going to do this a little differently.
Yes,
She's
we're having
going
an
to
interesting challenge where
call
you
me
both can hear us, you all can hear us both, but we
on the
can't,
phone,
he can't hear
tell me
me.
the questions. I will then relay the answers to you. Okay, I think we're good to go.
Okay, so John, first question is, I saw morning glory picture on your slide. Is that considered a weed? Because it's so beautiful.
That morning glory, that particular one was called field bind weed. And yes, it does produce a pretty flower, but it is insidious, has extremely deep roots, and is very difficult to control. You don't want that plant. Next.
I have a white spotted thing just on my cacti plants. Would you know what that is or how to
Yeah,
get rid of it?
most likely mealybug. We didn't discuss mealybugs in our presentations, but they're usually controlled the same way that you would control scale. So mealybug can be sprayed, or you can use systemics in the soil of your cactus and succulents. Mealybugs love cactus and succulents, yes.
Hold on, we're doing feedback because I'm on two things. John, can you, oh no, that won't work either. Hold on. They're hearing my talking on your phone as well as on your computer.
So they're hearing you ask the question.
Yeah, but because they can, let's see if I mute myself here. This will work. They won't hear me ask the question, but maybe this can work.
Well, okay.
We have a couple people that ask, how do you sterilize? What's the best way to sterilize your cutting tools?
Okay. So, yes, sterilizing your cutting tools can be very simple. If you're going to be doing a lot of pruning, you can just fill up a bucket with water and 10% bleach, 90% water, and dip your pruners in there each time. I've taken alcohol, rubbing alcohol, or Lysol in a little spray thing and sprayed my pruners after every cut. So any disinfectant, bleach works, alcohol works, Lysol works, and there's probably others too. But the important thing is you do it after each cut so that you don't spread the disease. Okay, next.
What is the best type of edging to use to prevent grass shoots from growing underneath into your flower beds?
Oh, the question was about using edging to prevent grasses from going into flower beds. And depending on the type, there are creeping grasses, Bermuda, kikuyu grass, St. Augustine, and zoysia. These creep, and they go underground. You would need a real deep barrier, either cement or corrugated metal, some sort of very deep border to prevent that. That's not an easy thing. There's no easy fix for that. You've got to dig, trench, and put something in there to prevent the creeping grasses from moving in. Okay.
So as we were talking about sterilizing tools, someone added, is there a natural solution? I think that, Sal, is that what you were referring to? On sterilizing tools, add that.
Yeah, but I hear the question. I guess you're asking, is there a natural sterilant for pruning tools?
People are asking about vinegar, both as a weed killer. If you give more information about that, I think that would address the question.
Okay, yeah. So, no, use the products that I mentioned to sterilize your pruning shears. You don't want to use something that's not going to work, because then you're just going to be spreading the disease. Okay. I don't think rubbing alcohol is going to harm you if you spray it on your pruners.
Okay.
But okay, now regarding the vinegar, you have to buy a 20 or 30% concentration of vinegar, and that's not available in grocery stores or at Smart and Final. The vinegar that you use, that you have in your pantry, that's 5% vinegar. That won't kill weeds. The vinegar that is designed for weed killing is much more concentrated. As I mentioned, 20 to 30%. Now you can buy citric acid over the counter. It's used in cooking, and the addition of citric acid to the vinegar makes a very potent weed killer, and that's all natural. That's all natural. So those would be safe and effective means of controlling weeds without chemicals. Okay. Next.
Yeah, it looks like we just have, scan through these, I think we just have one more. Vicky says, good morning, great information. Do you recommend copper fungicide powder in a tomato plant?
Copper. It's yeah, copper fungicide.
Okay.
Yeah, copper is all natural. Copper is natural. Do I recommend it? If there's a problem and copper will solve the problem, then yes. Most of the problems I see with tomato plants come from excessive moisture. And remember, a tomato plant grows like this. If the leaves down here are turning ugly, yellow, or something, it doesn't affect the plant. Your fruit, flowering, your new growth is up here. I don't look at the old leaves on a tomato plant. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I did. So.
Okay. So her second part of that was, then if you use copper fungicides, it's safe to wash and eat the tomato.
Yes, it's all natural. It's all natural. Copper is a naturally occurring mineral. It exists in the soil. That's where it came from.
Okay. All right. It looks like we have reached the end of our questions. So I'm going to unmute myself and mute myself on the phone so we don't have the feedback, and unmute on the computer to give just some final words here.
Okay.
Okay, thank you everybody for your patience with our minor technical challenges. We invite you to come back again next month, August 7th, for the top 30 plants for the Santa Clarita Valley. This program has been recorded and we will be posting it on our garden class webpage for further review. So thank you for the kind words and the questions, John. A lot of people got a lot of good information from this today. We appreciate your time. All right. Thanks, everybody.